hits all the time.
We are family.
Outstanding effort again.
We're busting ours to kick yours.
That's big time.
-15.
Respect all, fear none.
Oh, did he belt that one?
Intensity is not a perfume.
It was a no-doubter.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are up in the bird's nest here at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Brendan Mortensen alongside Annie Klaff. Annie, your soccer bobblehead is
She's
back
back.
out front because it is our soccer season. We're playing some rec soccer. We came up short in the championship last season, did not get off to a good start this season in week 1. I'm not going to say it was anybody's fault up top. It was my fault.
It was
my fault up top.
most definitely Brendan's fault.
It was.
And now he's
Yeah.
injured, so he can't even play next week.
Yeah, I was viciously stomped on in our week 1 matchup and probably out for week 2.
Pathetico Madrid, which is our team name, we're so cooked for the rest of the
We
season.
lived up to it for week 1. We were missing some players. We've got some key injuries. I'm not a key injury. I'm just kind of an injury. It technically counts.
You're a number. We
I'm a
needed
body.
you on the bench.
I'm a warm body.
We needed you to keep the bench warm.
Right, exactly.
And, now we can't rely on that.
No,
So.
not at all. But listen, we'll turn things around. If Annie's bobblehead has anything to say about it, then our soccer season should be off to a solid start. We were good last season.
Yeah, we were. We almost
hopefully
won
we'll pick
in
it
the
up.
finals.
Almost.
Yours truly scored 2 goals in the
In
semifinals.
the semis, but how many did you score in the finals?
Well, how many
Well-
have you scored all season?
Well, let's not
Exactly.
get into those details. We have a lot of Orioles details to get into
Sure thing.
that don't include my lack of goals in our rec soccer league. We've got a lot to talk about this offseason in terms of what the Orioles' needs are, what positions they need to fill, who could fill those positions this offseason. But as the hot stove has kicked off, makes sense to start with the free agents from Baltimore. Their own free agent class includes some big names. The free agent class in total for the Orioles includes 9 players: Corbin Burnes, Anthony Santander, James McCann, Eloy Jimenez, Austin Slater, John Means, Danny Coulombe, Matt Bowman, and Craig Kimbrell. There are some of those names that we are just kind of assuming will not be back in Baltimore, players that the Orioles declined their options, guys like Eloy Jimenez, Craig Kimbrell was DFA'd during the season, Matt Bowman, Danny Coulombe, the Orioles declined his option. It is still possible that he comes back on a deal worth less than $4 million. We talked about that last week. And then, somebody like Austin Slater, we're not going to spend a ton of time on. He was a trade deadline acquisition last year, filled a very specific role. It's possible that he's back on a smaller deal, but even if Slater is back next year, he's not going to play a massive role. So the guys we're going to talk about today: Corbin Burnes, Anthony Santander, James McCann, John Means. I think those are kind of the big 4 of the 9 that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of names that you have kind of heard throughout the season, towards the end of the season, like, okay, is the Orioles' new ownership willing to bring back a name like Santander or Corbin Burnes? Because Corbin Burnes was one of those guys that the Orioles did get last offseason, and that was a huge play, a huge move that the Orioles wouldn't have made it this far this season without him. And some other names like that, too. I mean, James McCann is a very underrated player for that matter of being an unsung hero, a leader in that clubhouse, and another one of those guys you'd like to see back in Baltimore this coming season. So definitely some big names on that hot stove, whether those choices will be named sooner rather than later, but big names you want to see, if not in Baltimore, succeed further on.
Yeah, and we probably won't see a ton of moves happen over the next, few weeks here. Things really start to pick up in the offseason around the winter meetings. Players are just kind of feeling things out at this point in terms of what teams are interested, what their possibilities are looking like. So we probably have some time before the bigger names start to come off the board. That's usually like a mid-December thing when that starts happening. But natural place to start is with the Orioles' own free agent class. And you mentioned Corbin Burnes, so we'll start with Corbin Burnes. He is the biggest fish of the Orioles free agents. His 2024 stats, 32 games with a 15-9 record, a 2.92 ERA, 8.5 Ks per 9, just over 2 walks per 9, and 194 innings pitched. He was an all-star for the 4th consecutive season. He was the starter in the American League, and he pitched over 190 innings for the 3rd consecutive season. That 2.92 ERA was the lowest that he had posted since winning the Cy Young with the Brewers back in 2021. Corbin Burnes was exactly what the Orioles traded for. Obviously, you wanted some more playoff success with trading for one of the best pitchers in all of baseball, but he did all that he could in his one start in the wild card series against the Royals, and he was outstanding all season for a rotation that was really bogged down by injuries. You know, Grayson Rodriguez, John Means, Kyle Bradish, Tyler Wells. We had talked about the injuries all season long, and Corbin Burnes just posted every 5th day. I think when you're looking at the stats, the 2.92 ERA is obviously fantastic, but really for this Orioles team, the value came in the fact that he threw 194 innings and he started 32 games. He was the only member of this rotation that was a consistent every 5 days he was out there.
Yeah, and consistent is exactly what you kind of need to know about Corbin Burnes, and I think that this is someone who is definitely going to be valued amongst all teams looking for starting pitchers this offseason. Rightfully so. I mean, going upwards of 190 innings pitched for 3 straight years is incredible.
Yeah.
And you only hope that that health continues for Corbin Burnes, because that is going to be huge for who he is and his valuation as a player. And you're right, the Orioles did get exactly what they were bargaining for out of this trade from the Brewers in the offseason last February, and was everything that the O's needed and more. It just didn't play out the way it needed to in the postseason by combining 8 innings pitched from Burnes in a playoff game, which should win you a game. It did not balance out well with Orioles offense, and it just did not go the way that one would have hoped back when you made this trade in February. But it also goes to show that the Orioles, I mean, that trade doesn't happen if not for the player development system and the farm system that the Orioles have developed over the years, and you can only hope that this offseason, say they don't get Burnes back, which is likely, that the Orioles can make another splash like that for another starting pitcher.
Yeah, I mean, when you are going back and looking at the trade when it initially happened, you can't look at Corbin Burnes' season and say that trade didn't make sense. I know when you're looking at the playoffs, yes, you would have liked more success, and it feels like you fell short. But as mentioned, Burnes was outstanding in that playoff start. He was outstanding all season long. That trade worked. You got exactly what you wanted out of Corbin Burnes. And when you're weighing, the pros and cons of bringing him back, there's really not that many cons. Yeah. I mean, you can look at the season as a whole and say, okay, it was the lowest strikeouts per 9 of his career since he became a starter, but he was just pitching a little bit differently to make sure that he was giving you that longevity and was healthy for the playoffs and, just was able to post every 5th day. Yes, the strikeouts weren't there as much, but it was a better ground ball rate than we had seen from him in the past. And he was commanding really, really well. He was still the 80th percentile in expected ERA, 89th percentile in chase rate, 80th percentile in walk rate, 95th percentile in hard hit rate. So he wasn't the dominant strikeout pitcher that we had been accustomed to seeing Burnes as in Milwaukee, but he was still a dominant pitcher, and he would still have games where he would strike out a ton of guys. He was still your ace every 5th day. Really, the biggest downside with the possibility of bringing back Corbin Burnes is what it is going to cost to get him. He's probably looking at around $30 million a year. The Spot Track estimated contract for Burnes is 6 for $180. I would not be surprised at all if that market gets driven up, because there are some other good starting pitchers on the market, guys like Blake Snell, Max Fried, Nick Martinez. There are other guys available that the Orioles or other teams in baseball can make a play for, but Corbin Burnes is just a different breed of dude. I know he's not quite the dominant pitcher that, say, a Garrett Cole was coming out in free agency, but it's pretty darn close. Multiple top Cy Young finishes, bona fide ace. Garrett Cole was entering his age 29 season. Corbin Burnes will be entering his age 30 season. I think it's probably going to cost close to $200 million, if not more than $200 million, to get Corbin Burnes. And look, I understand that there are 4 or 5 teams in baseball that can hand out $250 million contracts like they're candy. The Orioles fall under the umbrella of the other 27, 28 teams in baseball, where handing out a $200 million contract is a really big deal. And so when we talk about the fact that they might not be able to bring back Corbin Burnes, it is not an indictment of the Orioles specifically. They just don't have the same kind of money that a Mets or a Yankees or a Dodgers, and that is nothing against the Orioles. They are just a normal baseball team with a normal market size that is going to spend a normal amount of money, and they are on the smaller size of that market size as well. So that is not an indictment of the Orioles if they do not bring back Corbin Burnes. He's going to cost a lot of money, and you have other players on this roster that are either up for contract extensions or will be soon. You have to pay other guys internally as well. So do you want to hitch your wagon to Corbin Burnes for a 6-7 year deal worth $180, $200, $220 million? That's the evaluation that the Orioles need to make.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I mean, the Orioles' identity, team identity, is just different from the Dodgers and the Yankees and the Mets and everyone who will most likely be honing in closely on Burnes. And yes, Burnes deserves every single penny that he will make from maybe likely one of those top teams. But, I mean, this is a guy who had somewhat of a tough August and then came back with 5 starts in September after that rough stretch with a 1.20 ERA, and that's because he found that cutter, and it was really cool to watch Burnes go through a stellar season overall and then have some kind of ups and downs in and out, especially in August, but then really like getting all the way back to his top potential once he finds that cutter. And it is really cool to see that, yes, he might not be able to use that in Baltimore, but it'll be worth it for a team that gets him in the future.
Yeah, I mean, he's had the best cutter in baseball for years, and he lost it a little bit this season in terms of how he was throwing it. The run value on the cutter, plus 20. It's the best cutter in baseball. Again, it has been for the past 4 seasons. Corbin Burnes is really, really good. The Orioles could use an ace. So could every other team in baseball. So if the Orioles decide that Corbin Burnes is the guy, and they are confident that he is going to be a great starting pitcher for the next 5-6 seasons, which is entirely possible. Again, I think the Garrett Cole comparison is not that far off. This is a Cy Young caliber pitcher who has done it for years and years and years, still just entering his age 30 season. So it's not like you're signing a 33-year-old guy in free agency. Corbin Burnes should have a lot of years of his prime left. The Orioles just need to make the decision, okay, are we hitching the wagon to Corbin Burnes with a $200 million contract, or do you go and make some moves on the margins in the starting rotation and hand out some bigger contracts elsewhere? Because there are a lot of guys on this roster that are going to be due for pretty big contracts in the pretty near future. So we'll see what the Orioles decide to do. There is really no downside, I don't think, to signing Corbin Burnes outside of the massive contract. There are no question marks for me in terms of the value of Corbin Burnes. He is going to be worth whatever contract he gets.
Yeah.
You just have to decide whether you're going to be the team to do it or not. Let's move on to the other really big name in this conversation, and that's Anthony Santander. He has been a fixture in Baltimore for years now. 8 total years with the Orioles over an 11 Baseball Reference WAR, 155 home runs, 435 RBIs. Such a cool story as well. This was a Rule 5 draft pick of the Orioles back in 2016, despite not having played above high A. They keep him on the roster. He goes down to the minors a little bit, mashes in Double A, comes back up, and is excellent. And credit to Anthony Santander. In 2024, he had a career year in a contract year. 155 games, the best of his career. 506 slugging percentage, best of his career. 814 OPS, 44 homers, 102 RBIs, all the best of his career. Made his first All-Star game. Was a solid defender in right field. Definitely showed strides and improvements. He was still below average metrically, but made a lot of strides in right field. And he was healthy, which is something that has been an issue with Anthony Santander for a lot of seasons in the past. He did everything that he could to prove that he is worthy of a big contract. He is going to get a big contract. And the Orioles have to decide, again, whether Santander is a player that they want to commit to long-term, because Santander is going to garner a long-term commitment contract-wise from some team, Baltimore or not.
Yeah, I mean, he was just named AL Silver Slugger winner. This was the season you would have hoped to see from Santander. You're right, it is a Rule 5 draft success story, a really cool story that Santander played for this Baltimore squad. I mean, Elias coined him as, quote, one of the key figures in bringing this franchise back to relevance, playoff competitiveness, excitement, and filling the ballpark, which is insanely true, every single word of that. He is a key player to this team's identity through those rebuilding years, and it would be sad to see him go. But again, this is another player like Corbin Burnes that he does deserve every penny that he's going to be given for the next season and beyond. And you do have to look at it, well, if you do end up not bringing back Santander, that is an area of need. We talked about this last week, where you lose Burnes or you lose Santander, that obviously becomes an area of need. It's kind of where you lose someone, you need someone. And that's a clear thing, but he's also a veteran bat at this point and a leader in the clubhouse in terms of morale. But also, he brought this team back throughout this season, throughout many offensive slumps throughout the year. There were sure some question marks on his offense and defense in some ways, whether that be his on-base percentage or his range out in the outfield. But overall, this is a player that really helped bring this Orioles team back to relevance throughout the years.
Yeah, and I think even more than in the case of Corbin Burnes, who only spent a season in Baltimore, the evaluation of Anthony Santander is hard to make without having some emotion in it, because he has been such an important player in Baltimore, so important in the clubhouse. He has had some clutch moments, especially this season. Just so many huge Anthony Santander moments. Walk-offs, grand slams. Santander, you're right. When the Orioles were slumping, it felt like Santander was the guy to help drag them out of it. And it would be really sad to see somebody like Santander go, who was, in the midst of this rebuild, a diamond in the rough. Yeah. You found him as a Rule 5 draft pick, developed him. It has been so great to hear about how he's been taking better care of himself and making sure that he is on the field and staying consistent and all of those things. That is all great. But now that Anthony Santander is a free agent, you have to look at it from all different angles. And as good as Santander was this season, an 814 OPS, 44 home runs, you also have to question the sustainability of seasons like that. Because Santander, entering his age 30 season, you would be signing him to be your starting right fielder. Right field is not a place where you need an elite defender. It can be a player of Santander's archetype who is just a slugger, and he's fine in right field. The defense was improved, but he was still 28th percentile in outs above average, 23rd percentile in arm value, 18th percentile sprint speed. So it's still a below average defender in right field, even though we saw better flashes from him this season. The question for me with Santander, if you are signing him, you are signing him because of the bat. The defense can be what it is, and you can live with it in right field if he's giving you 44 home runs and 102 RBIs. The question with Anthony Santander is whether that offensive production is sustainable. Because to me, I think that is a real question. The batting average went down to 235 this year. We had been accustomed to seeing Santander around, 240, 250, so at least a little bit higher. The on-base percentage was at 308. I know Santander did not have a good BABIP, which is batting average and balls in play. That number would indicate to you that he got a little bit unlucky, but the on-base percentage was 308. And you would really like that to be closer to what we saw in 2023 with a 325. Realistically, you'd like to see it closer to a 330, 340. Walk a little bit more, get on base a little bit. He did have a career high in walks this season with 58, but that was just because he played more games. It's still not a very high walk rate. 44 home runs was the most of his career by a wide margin. Again, it helps that he stayed healthier, but back in 2022, with 152 games, he hit 33 home runs. Not that 33 home runs is not valuable. If he can give you 30-plus home runs and 90-plus RBIs a year for the next 3 years, then signing Santander to a 4-year contract still makes a lot of sense. But as a player with a 308 on-base percentage, going to continue to give you enough slugging to be a well above average offensive player. Because if you are giving Santander the contract that he will probably command, SpotTrack is calculating his market value at about $17.5 million a year, a contract estimate of around $5 for $88 million. If you are giving him that type of contract, then it has to be 35 home runs a year because the defense isn't good, the on-base percentage isn't good, the slugging has to be excellent, and you have to be really sure that that is going to be sustainable season to season.
Yeah, and I think it also begs the question and the conversation of, which we've talked about many times throughout the season, are the Orioles are definitely a home run heavy team, but at what point do they become home run reliant? And I don't think at all this season they were that, but the home run ball is not going to necessarily help you win games in middle October or beginning of October, even September when it starts getting colder. So we had that discussion many times when the Orioles were slumping. Is it because they are home run reliant? No, they weren't at some points, but when Santander did bring the O's out of their offensive slumps, it often was with a grand slam or a home run, which was obviously what you needed. But at what point is that going to push you into the postseason push that you need if you're only relying on slugging capability instead of just on-base percentage?
Sure. On-base percentage is something that the Orioles were kind of middle of the road with this season. And it was a team, as you mentioned, that relied pretty heavily on the home run ball. And that's not a terrible formula. You can win with home runs, and you can win with home runs once you get into October, but you need to get on base as well. And Anthony Santander did not do that at a high enough clip this season. So I don't know. It's a toss-up for me in terms of what the Orioles will do with Santander. I think in a vacuum, you would love to have him back. I think Anthony Santander has made it clear that he would like to be back.
You can tell he loves this club and loves the fan base.
Yeah.
And the fans love him. I mean, he was like their pride and joy this year.
Yeah. And there's nobody banging on the door. I mean, Heston Kjerstad is capable of being a close to everyday outfielder. I think if you lose Anthony Santander, you are probably looking at signing a right-handed hitting outfielder to platoon with Heston Kjerstad, potentially platoon with Cedric Mullins as well. It's just going to be a pretty big contract for Santander. And it's a pretty big contract to give out for somebody that you are just relying on the power numbers with, because the defense is not great. The on-base percentage is not great. But what he gives you at the plate is awesome. It is a middle-of-the-lineup bat, switch hitter. He's only entering his age 30 season, and he just stayed healthy for the first time in his career, and hopefully that's something that he can sustain. This one I truly don't know on. Corbin Burnes felt like, okay, the contract is going to be huge. There might be another team that just throws $250 million at Corbin Burnes, and they say, and there he goes. Anthony Santander, if you can find a way to keep Santander for a 3-4 year deal, $70-80 million, I don't know. I think that's around the contract that he will command, because this is a good power hitting corner outfielder. Just don't know if it'll be in Baltimore. I think there's a good chance that he stays, but I could also see it making sense where it's, okay, we've got Kjerstad. He's ready to be a close to an everyday player. We can platoon him there and make up for Santander in the margins and find other quality pieces elsewhere. I really don't know on this one.
Yeah.
This one feels like a toss-up to me.
I agree completely. I won't add too much to that, but it also does seem like if they don't go with bringing back Santander, maybe it's because they're relying on Kjerstad, Mullins, and then maybe bringing in another veteran bat that could shake some things up in the outfield and also on offense too. You really don't know with this one. Yeah,
if they don't retain Santander, there are other free agents that I am sure we will talk about at some point, between Teoscar Hernandez, Tyler O'Neill, Jurickson Profar, other guys that fit the corner outfield profile that the Orioles could use. Teoscar and Tyler O'Neill, especially, that are Santander-esque players. They're just hit from the right side of the plate. So there are plenty of other options out there, but Santander, such a great dude, has been fantastic in Baltimore. Would love to see him back. We'll see what happens. I think that's really a toss-up for me. Next guy I want to talk about is James McCann. Spent the last 2 seasons in Baltimore as Adley Rutschman's backup, had a 1.3 baseball reference WAR. His stats are not eye-popping. 228 batting average, 657 OPS in his 2 seasons. He has been solid as a backup catcher defensively. The metrics are not great, but he works really well with pitchers. We have heard Brandon Hyde talk about it, where that's the kind of thing that doesn't really show up in an advanced metric. He's 11th percentile in blocks above average, 14th percentile in framing, but he does things that don't show up in those metrics. He calls a really good game. He works with the pitchers very well. He works with Adley Rutschman very well. By all accounts, he is just a good guy to have around. The estimated contract is probably a 1-year, $2-3 million deal. I think it makes a lot of sense to bring James McCann back. Samuel Basallo is on the way. He is in AAA Norfolk right now. He has some strides that he still needs to make defensively, and he's still a really, really young dude in AAA Norfolk as well. He needs some more time there. I don't know if it's going to be a full season. Maybe we see Samuel Basallo by July or August, but he is not ready to come up and be a backup catcher right away. He could play a role, but bringing in somebody like James McCann, who has the understanding of what his role is, and he has really embraced that role in Baltimore. He knows Adley Rutschman is the guy, and he loves working with Adley Rutschman. He loves working with the players, and he has been so important in the clubhouse as one of the few veteran leaders that the Orioles have. I mean, it's James McCann, it's Ryan O'Hearn, a few veteran pitchers here and there. Those are really the guys that you have turned to over the past few seasons. And I think bringing McCann back makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, there is in no way that I would be upset with the Orioles bringing McCann back. In fact, I hope they do, because I think that he is the epitome of a clubhouse player and a leader. I mean, you take a look at when he takes 95 miles per hour to the nose, starts gushing blood, and then stays in the whole game just so that Adley didn't have to catch for a doubleheader game. I mean, what does that say to the younger players in the clubhouse in terms of grit, perseverance, and just basically being a team player? Because he barely took any time off of that and then still continued to catch and with practically 2 eyes swollen shut. I don't know how that happened. But I think if you got him back, you're getting him back not only for a backup catcher for Adley, who at some points even stepped in for that role when Adley was slumping and other offensive players were slumping. I mean, you take a look at James McCann's stats in September. He batted .324 with 4 home runs and 11 RBIs. He stepped up many times throughout the season, offensively and defensively, with catching for Corbin Burnes as the first game in the playoffs. I mean, he might not have been or produced the offensive performance in the playoffs that you would have hoped from James McCann or anyone in that position in the playoffs. But this is a guy that you get for the clubhouse and leadership and veteran kind of presence that you aren't necessarily getting from many other people on this young squad.
Yeah, he's a really good backup catcher. I know the numbers aren't outstanding, but a lot of catchers around baseball are not outstanding. There are probably a dozen teams in baseball that James McCann would have started for the past 2 seasons. He was a luxury to have in Baltimore. I know he wasn't a fixture in the lineup, and I know he wasn't producing eye-popping numbers, but he was still really good for a backup catcher. And honestly, the way that I view this, there are some other options available that you could bring in for the same kind of role, like Kurt Casale, Luke Maile. There are other older veteran catchers that can come in and do the same thing. If all else is equal and the contracts are going to be pretty similar, I would just rather bring somebody back that's familiar with Baltimore, has liked it here by our accounts at least, has worked well with the pitching staff, already has a rapport there with them and with Adley Rutschman. if you're going to bring in that archetype of player, which I think is really the only archetype of catcher that makes sense, you only need pretty much a stopgap until Samuel Basayo comes up and is your number 2 catcher. So you just need somebody who is a veteran presence, can back up Adley Rutschman, can catch on days when Adley is DHing or needs an off day. Adley, throughout his career, I mean, Adley was better from the right side of the plate last year, but is usually better from the left side. James McCann is a right-handed hitter, and it also gives Adley the opportunity to DH if he is still thriving from the right side of the plate. James McCann can come in against a lefty. Just think if that's the exact player that you need, which it seems like it is, just go get James McCann. He's already done it, and he's already been good at it. That's just kind of my thinking there. Last player to talk about, John Means. And this is a very interesting conversation because John Means has only appeared in 10 games over the last 3 seasons. We know the kind of pitcher that John Means has been, but at this point, we're looking at the 2025 season, and we are still going back to the numbers that we have seen from John Means in 2021. It's the last time that he had a healthy season, a 3.62 ERA in his 26 starts, the last time that he was healthy. He made 4 starts last year with a 2.61 ERA. 4 starts the year before, 2.66 ERA. He has been good when he has been on the field, but obviously it is 2 major elbow surgeries. It's multiple-time Tommy John. That's a really hard thing to come back from. And so John Means at this point, I know the name value when you see him as a free agent, you still go, oh man, like John Means, that's a really good pitcher. That's somebody that you want in your rotation. After multiple elbow surgeries and, not getting up there age-wise, he's not going to be too old going into the 2025 season, especially for a pitcher. He's just going to be in his age 32 season. But you can't rely on him as a fixture in the rotation. I think it's possible that the Orioles bring him back on a 1-year deal with a pretty low number value just to try to get him rehabbing and see if you can get him in the building, and maybe you can get something from Means this season far down the stretch. But as a free agent, I would be shocked if Means commands a multi-year deal anywhere. I think it's just going to be a prove it somewhere type of thing.
Yeah, this is a hard one to pin down, especially because it's so hard to bet on a guy that has had 2 Tommy John surgeries in the span of 26 months.
Yeah,
that's hard to come back from. And yes, he was practically a great pitching leader during those rebuilding years for the Orioles. And it is, like you said, a name that you kind of latch onto and you're like, okay, it would be great to see him back in Baltimore, but you also forget he's probably going to miss almost the entirety of the 2025 season too because of getting another Tommy John surgery recently. And you just don't know where his numbers are going to stand after this second one. I mean, one is hard to come back from, and he really did have some pretty good starts after coming back from the first one. He put up 7 scoreless innings in his debut in May this year, but then you kind of lose that hope a little bit after the second one. And I know we talk a lot about a clubhouse guy and a leader for this squad, especially because the Orioles' identity is such a young team, and he's a huge part of being a leader amongst these people, and that it is hard to kind of part from. But again, betting on 2 Tommy John surgeries in the span of a little bit over 2 years is really hard.
Yeah, and that's why you can't bet on it, right? You can't bring John Means back and say, this is the 5th starter in our rotation. John Means has the talent, I think, to do that. We still haven't seen him after this second Tommy John surgery, obviously. But he has shown in the past that he has the talent. If he is close to the pitcher that we saw in 2021, that's a really good pitcher. But that's 4 years ago going into next season at this point. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Orioles bring him back on a 1-year small money deal just because he has been around the organization for so long. He was an all-star back in 2019. He was through the thick of things in this rebuild. Means has also been incredible in the community. He is very involved. This is where it's hard to separate the person aspect of it from the player aspect of it, because from a personal level, you would really like John Means back in Baltimore just because he's a great dude. He's great in the clubhouse. He's great in the community, all of those things. It wouldn't surprise me if he is back in Baltimore on a 1-year small money deal because the Orioles want to do right by him and just say, hey, you know what? Rehab, like you're not going to be on the 40-man roster. Just, come back, rehab, and we'll see if there's something there down the stretch. My hope for John Means is that happens somewhere, that he gets a 1-year deal where it's small money and some team is just hoping that, they can rehab, get him back to his previous self. I wouldn't be surprised at all if it is Baltimore that ends up being the team to do that. But you just kind of have to hope for the best. After multiple Tommy John surgeries, that is a really short stretch of time to have those surgeries back to back. And as a player, it's just hard to evaluate outside of the fact that you can't rely on him as a rotation piece at this point because you just have to see it. Unfortunately, we haven't seen it in a while.
Especially when you also have lots of young potential with guys like Cade Povich, Chase McDermott, Brandon Young. I mean, yes, it's a completely different person that you'd be betting on and putting faith into because it is a young pitcher who doesn't have that experience, whereas John Means is one of those guys who has been there through the thick of it for this team. So totally, completely different players, but I think it would be more likely that the Orioles are going to put their faith into a Cade Povich who showed out for the Orioles this season when they needed him, when there were lots of other injuries going on.
Yeah.
And then you also have that depth in the system with Chase McDermott, Brandon Young, and many other people too.
Yeah, John Means is not going to be a factor in the Orioles rotation for the 2025 season. If John Means is retained and you see him rehab and he starts to work his way back up, that's more of a pleasant surprise than anything else. And again, I wouldn't be shocked if the Orioles say, okay, 1-year deal, small money, come back. We'll see if we can get you back to where you want to be after 2 elbow surgeries, where you can still pitch to the level that you want to. Wouldn't be shocked by that at all, but John Means isn't going to be blocking any prospects. He's not going to be a fixture in the rotation. This is just you hope something works out.
Right.
And we hope that something works out for John Means because, as mentioned, great dude, great in the community, deserves to be somewhere. So a lot of big decisions looming for the Orioles with their own free agent class. I think as we go on in the offseason, probably next week, we're going to talk about what holes the Orioles have on this roster. But we kind of needed to have this conversation first because if you don't retain Corbin Burnes, then you have a hole at the top of your rotation. And if you don't retain Anthony Santander, then you have a hole in the outfield. So a lot of what the Orioles are going to do this offseason is going to be determined by what they do with the guys in-house. Corbin Burnes and Anthony Santander being the two biggest names that those dominoes need to fall before the Orioles decide how they are going to proceed with their offseason. And then James McCann, another one too, where if James McCann doesn't come back, okay, then you need a backup catcher. So the holes on this team are really going to be decided by who comes back and who doesn't. But you would have to imagine that this is where the Orioles start with Corbin Burnes, with Anthony Santander, with James McCann. And if they can't bring those guys back, then they pivot. But I think Corbin Burnes, Anthony Santander especially, will be priorities for the Orioles this offseason. They're at least going to explore the possibility and see what they can do with those two guys especially. So we will see. A lot of decisions to be made, but I think that'll just about do it for this week's edition of The Bird's Nest. We were a little later than usual today at noon on YouTube and Facebook, but you can usually catch us live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on YouTube and Facebook, or you can catch us after the fact on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts or your digital shows. You can find us here on The Bird's Nest. We are going to have a ton of really in-depth podcasts this offseason. No games, so we really get to dive headfirst into all the storylines for the Orioles offseason, so make sure you stay tuned with us here all offseason long. Big thank you to Bobby Blanco behind the scenes for producing this one. For Andy Klaff, I am Brendan Mortensen, and we'll catch you next time.